So we've got our radar on the user interface and it turns with the ship, but it doesn't show anything about the direction or proximity of the enemy ships. So we need to add a bit more to that. One of the things is that the top of the radar here is always going to be where the ship is directed. So I think I'd like to mark that somehow. So what I'm going to do is add a little 3D object as a cube, and I'm going to reduce that quite considerably. So I'm going to scale it down to 0.1 in all directions. And so it's just a tiny little cube. I'm going to bring that up to the top of the radar. And I'm going to rotate it around the Z axis by 45 degrees. That'll be 0.5, which is the radius of the right, and that makes a nice little pointer. I'm going to make that a child of the radar assembly, not a child of the radar screen itself, just of the assembly, because it's going to be independent of the actual screen. I don't want it to rotate. I think I'll give it a color, so I'm going to go into the materials and create a new material. I'm going to call this one green and choose the color, which is going to be green. And I'm going to apply that to this cube, which I shall rename pointer. Right, so now we have a pointer, and because it's right at the edge, we can only see half of the cube, so it looks like a triangle, which is good. The next thing we need to do is to put some blips on the screen. The blips are the name we give to the little points on a radar screen. So I'll create another object. This is a sphere, and I'll bring it down to about the same size as the pointer. So I'm reducing the scale to 0.1 in all directions. So there's our blip. Perhaps I'll make it a bit easier to see by changing the color from white to, say, red. So I'll create a new material. I call this one red. And we'll select the color. Add that to the sphere. Okay, that looks quite good. And I'll call that a blip. Now I'll want to make blips for all of the enemies that appear within range, so I'll need to make that into a prefab. So I'll just put that down into the prefabs folder. So there's our blip. I don't need this one on the screen anymore. Right, now we'll have to turn our attention to the game control script, which is in the game controller object. So I'll just edit that script. And here it is. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put another reference to our radar screen. And again, I'm only interested in its transform component. I'll just call that radar. Okay. I'll also need to put blips on our radar screen, so I'll need a reference to the prefab blip, and that's the game object. Now, one of the things I'm going to do with this radar is to get it to flash on and off as radar screens do. So I'll need an update time, which is how often I'm going to update the radar screen. So I'll put in another public. This is going to be a float type, and I'll call this R underscore update and underscore time. I'll give that a default value of 0.5, so it should update itself every half second. The other thing is I want to know when the blips come within range. I don't want them to be on the radar as soon as they're created, so I'll put in another public float, and I'll call this radar range. Now I've decided my drum size is going to be 100, so I'll get it to come in at about 80. Right. Now I've got some more private variables to create. I want to make, yep, okay. I need to record when it was last updated. So I'll make this last update. Okay. I'll need to scale down the position of the ships. So our radar screen has got a radius of 0.5, and our radar range has got a radius of 80 at the moment, but it might change. So I'm going to put in private, that's another float, and it's going to be called scale factor. Right, now the next thing I'm going to do, I need to keep a record of where all the blips are. So I'm going to use a structure called a list. Now they're a bit like arrays. The main difference between a list and an array is that an array is of a fixed size, and you cannot increase that or decrease the size of an array, whereas you can with a list. The thing is, it's fairly new to Unity, and it's not in the general collections, so I need to specify another library, and that is using system.collections.generic, and that contains the definition of the list structure. So I'm going to put that in now as a private, and I'm going to define this as a list, and you have to define it's a list of what type of thing, and this is a list of game objects, and I'm going to call this enemies, and I'll instantiate that as a new list of game objects. Okay. Right, so we're ready to start. So we need to initialize some of these things. So the first thing is the last update, and we'll set that to the current time. Oh, there was one more private variable I need. So we need to know if the blips are showing or not showing. So I will make another Boolean variable, and I'll call this radar on. So down here in the start, we'll put radar on equals false. So the radar is not displaying blips when we start. And the other thing I need to initialize here is the scale factor. So we've got the radius of the quad or the radar screen is 0.5, and we're going to divide that by the radar range. So that's how much we have to scale down the blips. Now I actually erased the update function, and now I found out I really needed it, so I'm going to put it back in. Okay, so we've got our update function back in again. The first thing we've got to work out is if we need to update it. So we'll check if the current time is greater than the last update plus the update time. Sorry, the r_update time. Right, so if that's the case, then we need to do something about the radar. So first thing is if the radar is on, right, that means we've got to hide the blips. So we'll just put a function in here. So we need to hide blips. So scroll that up a bit. So alternatively, else we need to show the blips. After which we alternate the thing. So instead of having the radar on, we'll have it off. So we'll swap it over. So we'll say radar on equals not radar on. And this is our new update. So we'll now set the last update to the current time. Okay. So what we have to do now is define what we mean by hide blips and what we mean by show blips. Right, so hiding is the easiest thing to do. So we'll put in a new function. Hide blips. Right, so we've got a list of blips. We don't know how many blips there'll be in that, but we can just destroy all of the contents. So we'll just set up a loop. So this is a fixed iteration loop. We know how many times we're going to go through it. So we need a control variable, which I'll call I, and it's an integer type. We'll start with it being 0. And we're going to loop around this until, as long as I is less than Oops, I have made a mistake. What we're doing in the list is not enemies but blips. Right, sorry about that. So we've got the blips, and it's got a count property. So that's how many blips we've got. And each time around the loop, we're going to increase I by 1, so it's I++. So what we need to do is to go through each one of the blips, where there's 0 or more, and we destroy them. So it's using the same way as an array. We put the index within square brackets, and that destroys each blip in turn. So that will effectively hide the blips by destroying them. Okay, so when we create the blips or show blips, we need to create the list. So the first thing we'll do is we'll clear out anything in the blips list. So we'll just put in blips.clear. Right, so that makes sure we start off with an empty list. Now what we need to do is find out how many enemies we've got on the screen. Now thankfully we've tagged them all with the tag of enemy, and so we can find out each enemy and put them into a simple array. So I'm going to create an array now. So not one game object, but an array of game objects, and I'll call this enemies. Right. So all we need to do is find out how many game objects there are. So we've got find objects with tag, not find object, but we need to find as many as possible, as many as there are, and the tag is enemy in double quotes because it's a string. Right, so that will find all the enemies that we've got currently in the game and put them into an array of game objects. So what we need to do now is go through each enemy and find out if it's in radar range, and if so, we'll create a blip and position it on the screen. So we'll put up another loop, and this is going to be a for each loop. So we'll find out game object, and we'll say enemy. So what it'll do now is it'll go through this array called enemies and pick out each game object and call it enemy. So we can deal with them one by one. Right, so we need just to find out if it's in radar range. Right, so we'll check with that. So if enemy dot transform dot position dot magnitude. So remember that our ship is right at 0, 0. So this will give us a measure of how far it is from 0, 0, 0. So if we put it less than or equal to radar range. Right, so we're finding out where this enemy is and seeing if it's within radar range, and if that's the case, then we need to create a new blip. So I will do that by instantiating a blip. So I'm going to call this new blip. So that'll create a new blip. What we need to do now is to put it in the right place. Well, if you think about the ships, they're in the XZ plane basically. So the drum is X across and Z forward. However, the radar screen is X across and Y, so it's in the XY plane. So what we need to do is translate that and scale it. So I'm going to put in another float. I'm going to call this XPOS. And that's the enemy.transform.position.x. So we get its X distance. And we're going to multiply that by the scale factor. So that brings it down to the right scale, and it's still on the x-axis. So the next one is the y. This is similar. But instead of the y now, we're checking the z. And we don't really need to worry about the Z position because we're going to just set that to be 0 so it's in the same plane as the radar screen. So I'm going to create a new vector 3 and assign it to the new blip transform position. So we've got the new blip. So a new vector 3, and we're going to make this up an X pos and the Y pos, and the Z pos is going to be 0. Right, so what we need to do now is to actually put that into position, and we'll do that by making the blip a child of the radar screen. So what we do is set the transform as a child of another transform. Right, so we've got this new blip.transform, and we're going to do is set its parent. So we've got this set parent, and we're going to set it to the radar screen. Now we've got another little complication here. One is that if you make one object a child of another object, then its transform is changed so that the object remains in the same place in global space. Now in this case I don't want it to be that the blip stays at the same position. I want it to be repositioned with 0, 0, 0 at the center of the radar screen. So what I'm going to do is put in this other boolean, which is called world position stays, and I don't want it to stay in its world position. I want it to take up the new position. So I'm going to put that as false. Right, so it'll retain its transform position that we've created here. And what I'm going to do then is add that new blip to the blips. So so it added to the list. Oops. Okay, so that should actually clear the blips. That should show the blips, sorry. Let's check the code. And everything looks fine. Okay, so we need to do some setting up of the new variables. Right, so here are the variables, they've appeared. So I'm going to populate these new fields. So there we have the radar transform, and we've got the blip here. Right. So we've got our update time is 0.5, which we'll leave at the moment, see how it looks. And we've got the radar range equals 80. Let's save that and check that it works. So our radar is turning, no blips as yet. Ah, we have a blip, so I'll turn that to the front of us, and there's the ship. One to me. This makes it a lot easier to play. So we've got another blip coming up now. And there's the enemy. And another one. And so it goes on, but eventually I'll be found out. I'm doing remarkably well so far. You could make the game more difficult by reducing the time between enemies, but you might just want to have fun shooting down as many enemies as you can. So I've got a double attack now. Enough of this. Got a death wish come upon me. Of course, you might want to adjust some of the variables to make the game either easier or more difficult to play. But it's a playable game.